How to explain autism to anyone. Maybe you have your own favorite way of explaining autism to people. Really though, the best way depends on the situation and who you're talking to. Often there's a trade-off between accuracy and clarity. And as we'll see in this video, generally simpler messages are much clearer. You probably also have a personal preference for the level of nuance and complexity in your ideal answer. If you're the kind of person who likes to over-explain and add more and more details in the hope that that helps to get your point across, and as we'll see later, there are certain assumptions that that approach makes about your listener that may not necessarily be valid. So I'm going to systematically break down different explanations of autism according to their level of nuance and complexity. And through this lens, it'll be much easier to see why so many people have ideas about autism that are quite outdated. And if none of that makes sense, don't worry, it will soon. Hi everyone, Paul Micallef here from Autism from the Inside. I make weekly videos sharing the human side of autism, so make sure you hit subscribe to get the latest content. So first off, leave me an answer in the comments. How do you explain autism in 5 seconds to someone who asks you? Naturally, it depends on the situation and especially your relationship to the person who's asking you. But here are some of the top most popular responses. Firstly, a lot of people don't like to answer that question at all. Just because you are autistic doesn't mean it's your job to educate everyone around you about what autism is. So a perfectly legitimate answer is, look, it's hard to explain. Can you just look it up, please? As we saw on my video about autism versus AI, in terms of generic high-level responses, AI does a reasonable job of explaining what autism is. Alternatively, you could point people to your favorite resource. And if you have a favorite resource, please link it in the comments. Another very popular way to explain autism is that our brains are wired differently. It's often described as a different operating system. Most people pick either Mac or Windows and contrast one versus the other, although in my opinion Linux also works if your audience is likely to know what that is. In simple terms, these explanations describe autism as a natural occurring neurological difference that you're born with. If we wanted to expand this a little bit further, we could say that this brain difference mostly affects how we perceive the world, how we interact with the world, especially how we interact with the social world. I like to say one of the core characteristics of autism is having difficulty relating to your peers due to the difference that we talked about earlier. And for a lot of people, it feels like a life of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So you'll note that so far I've avoided giving you a definition and I've avoided trying to be too specific. I'm trying to give you a sense of what autism is, rather than nail down exactly what it is and what it isn't. It turns out that trying to define what anything is actually extremely difficult. Even very simple everyday things can be extremely difficult to define. An example I often use is, what is a flower? Every 3-year-old knows what a flower is. But can you define one? If I read you out the botanic definition of what a flower is, most of those words would probably be foreign. I know they are to me. And the lesson in that is that sometimes trying to be too precise with language can actually backfire and be unhelpful. So you may notice that some of the ideas we have in society are overly simplistic and not all that helpful. So to help you recognize that and respond to that effectively, let's look at how autism is described at various levels of complexity. I won't go into the theory today, so just ignore any references you don't understand. But the simplest level we'll look at is MHC level 9 concrete. Understanding autism at this level is by use of specific examples of specific people. Autism is Rain Man. Autism is Temple Grandin. Autism is the little girl in our kindergarten class who used to play dress-ups all day and never talk to anyone. At this very concrete level, there's no real idea of an abstract concept of what autism is, more just examples of people, and we are trying to piece it together based on those examples. To combat this tendency, you may have heard the expression, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Now that's great to explain that we're all individual, but it's going to leave the person still with this idea or this question of, what is autism though? I know everyone's individual, so what is it? The next level of complexity, level 10 abstract, deals with binary categories. Autistic person, non-autistic person. Everyone is either normal or autistic. Everyone in the autistic group is the same in every way that makes them autistic, just like apples are kind of the same in every way that makes them apples. At this level, the difference of autism is either characterized as a good difference or a bad difference. On the good side, some people say autism is a superpower or the latest stage of evolution or some other kind of rhetoric like that. And on the bad side, people say it's a disability and a tragedy and a disorder and all of these negative ideas. There's no acknowledgement that it can be both. You kind of have to pick. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? This is also where the idea of being more autistic and less autistic comes from. If autism is more or less one thing, then you can have more of it or you can have less of it. If you've ever heard someone use the term mild autism or severe autism, or if you've ever heard someone say, we're all a little bit autistic, this is the kind of paradigm that they're working in. As we'll see later, it's not wrong as such, but more oversimplified and not accurate because it's lacking nuance. A slightly more complicated idea is that autism is neurodevelopmental. This moves away from the binary born with it, not born with it, have it, not have it kind of idea to my brain is different because it has developed differently. Maybe faster than average, maybe slower than average, maybe in a completely different direction than average. At this level of complexity, we start to see 2E type language. You can be both gifted and disabled at the same time. You can have a spiky skill set, being good at some things and having massive gaps in other areas. Autism is no longer one difference, but a spectrum of difference. In other words, lots of differences in many areas that all come together into a unique profile. Now, up until this point, we're still dealing with the medical model of disability. Your autistic traits are compared to what's normal, and you're either above or below, ahead or behind what is considered the average. In other words, autism is defined as your difference from the average. At this level, rhetoric and interventions still focus on how do I help you to fix those gaps in your skill set? How do I help you to leverage your strengths? Complexity level 11 is very objective and scientific. It likes to measure variables and compare to averages. Once we get to complexity level 12, it's more about the system that we're in. And this is where we introduce concepts like neurodiversity and the social model of disability. This level of complexity considers individuals as a part of the bigger system. It makes it easier to see that every brain is different to every other brain. Always has been, always will be. It's a part of our biology. It's a property of our species. So normal is at best a statistical average. And when we look at autism through this lens, we can see that a lot of the disabling factors are actually present in the environment. Schools not built for us, workplaces not built for us, social settings that are just not designed with diversity in mind. Autism is no longer a problem with the individual. We have the concept of the double empathy problem. It takes two people to communicate. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, it's not 100% my fault. At the previous level, our strengths and weaknesses were all individual depending on our own unique spiky skill set. At this level, the spectrum of our privilege and disability depend on the intersectionality of dozens of social factors. Social class, race, background, gender, you name it. Trying to describe autism, though, in such complex, nuanced terms can be exceedingly difficult. If every brain is neurologically different from others in a variety of different ways, then why are some people neurodivergent and some people neurotypical? If it's society that's disabling us, is it really a disability? If my brain is just different, then why should I get special treatment when everyone's brain is different? At a lower level of complexity, when autism was defined by deficits in the diagnostic criteria, it was comparatively easy to make that call of what is autism and what is not autism. Now, with neurodiversity and intersectionality and the social model of disability, how do we define that? This is a bit advanced for most people, but I'll explain my answer anyway, just in case you get asked this question. Realistically, in most cases, if someone is not automatically understanding the neurodiversity, intersectionality, social model of disability type answers, then probably the best thing is to go back to a simpler idea of what autism is and help them understand whatever they need to at a simpler level of complexity. You can very effectively advocate for yourself, for example, without needing to first explain neurodiversity and the social model of disability. They're just helpful concepts if your brain is liking more complex answers. So back to my answer on this one. What is autism in the neurodiversity paradigm? It's essentially a tipping point. Yes, we're all different, but if you're different enough, you end up being disabled by society. I sometimes use the example of height. Yes, some people are taller than others, some people are shorter than others. If you're tall enough or short enough, it is entirely possible that you could consider yourself disabled. So multiply that across all of the domains that autism can make someone different. And if I have extreme hypersensitivity, for example, that disables me in lots of situations. Another way to describe this from a very social perspective is through the lens of ostracism. It's a natural human tendency to other people who are different. This is especially noticeable in children. Who gets bullied? The weird kid gets bullied. That's who. If you are perceived as different by enough other people in society, they will naturally discriminate against you in almost every situation, even if they're completely unconscious of it. It means that often socially we're fighting a losing battle before we've even come out of the starting blocks. If I haven't been able to manage my impressions, then before I even say hello, I've already made a bad first impression. What are the chances of making a good second impression? It's a lot harder to come back from that situation. Anyway, you get the idea. As you may have noticed, those last couple of examples are a lot more complex and a lot harder to understand than something much simpler like my brain is wired differently. I was born with a disability that makes it harder to interact socially with my peers. Completely different levels of complexity in both those explanations. Now you might notice that you have a preference for which type of explanation makes sense to you. Maybe the second I mentioned neurodiversity, you're like, yep, that one, that makes so much more sense to me. Or maybe you're thinking, neurodiversity is such a wishy-washy concept. Like, what is autism? The reason I've gone through these levels with you today is so that it's easier to hear the types of explanations that other people resonate with. I would always start simple. Everyone understands simple. And then if there are follow-up questions, then I can get a bit more nuanced. But so often I hear people give an answer something like, what is autism? Oh, it's complicated. Okay, yes, we know it's complicated, but if that's your answer, it doesn't actually help the listener to understand anything. It's a little bit like saying, it's too complex, you're not going to understand it. Or it's too complex, it's not able to be understood. If that's the case, then we need to simplify the message until it gets to the point where it can be easily understood. So what is autism? The most complex explanation is that it's a neurodevelopmental condition that leads to a tipping point of bad experiences. In this model, we're disabled by the system. If we simplify that a little bit, we could say that autism means my brain did not develop normally, and autism is therefore defined by significant deviations from the norm in several areas, such as social reciprocity and repetitive behaviors and things like that. At this level, yes, society can disable me more, but ultimately the problem, the difference is in me. If that's still too complex, we can simplify that again to say that autism is a condition where my brain is different. At this level, that difference will be assumed to be either good or bad. And if you give examples of that difference, you'll probably hear some level of, oh yeah, we're all a little bit like that. At this level, people will often ask what causes autism, and you'll either have to answer that question or introduce more complexity and nuance. I suggest just answering the question at that level of complexity. What causes autism? It's genetic. There's obviously more to it than that, but close enough. We don't need to explain more if the person isn't asking for a more nuanced answer. Anyway, I hope that makes some sense as to how ideas about autism get dumbed down and simplified in different contexts. In general, I personally would recommend starting simple and then adding more detail and more nuance only if requested. At least I know that helps my tendency to over-explain things, or to get overwhelmed by the question and have some kind of useless answer like, oh, it's really complicated. Anyway, I'd better leave it there. Hopefully that's been helpful and you can now recognize some of the levels of complexity involved in these ideas. This framework has also helped me get less frustrated at people, because when someone doesn't understand, it's not that they're just being an idiot, it's that I'm asking them to undergo an entire paradigm shift of how they see the world. So maybe it makes sense that that's too much to ask sometimes. I've got a couple more videos planned in this series, sharing some of my favorite analogies and empathy experiments to help people understand what the autistic experience is like. So keep a lookout for that over the coming weeks. If you're the kind of person who really appreciates an extra level of depth in your autism content, then make sure you check out the Autism from the Inside website. We have a mailing list where you can keep in touch with the latest news and also regular online events you can join as well. So I'd better leave it there for today. Please leave a comment letting me know which explanation resonated with you the most, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.